Section 5. The period of Israel's exile and return, and the period of the papal exile and return. By falling into faithlessness without repentance, the people of Israel failed to realize the ideal of God's nation founded upon the temple. To make another attempt at fulfilling this will, God had the people suffer hardships as exiles in Babylon. This was similar to when God had the Israelites suffer as slaves in Egypt to restore through indemnity Abraham's mistake in the symbolic offering. In the period of the Christian Empire, God worked through the Pope and the Emperor to establish a kingdom prepared for Christ at his second coming. God's intention was that ultimately they would bequeath the empire and the throne to the Messiah when he would come as the King of Kings and build God's kingdom upon that foundation. Yet, the emperors and popes became corrupt and did not repent. The popes did not lay the spiritual foundation upon which the emperors could stand as the central figures for the foundation of substance. Therefore, the foundation for the second advent of Christ was not established. To begin a new dispensation to restore this foundation, God allowed the popes to be taken into exile and suffer captivity. In the earlier parallel period, nearly 70 years elapsed from the time King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took into captivity King Jehoiachin and his royal family, as well as prophets including Daniel and Ezekiel, priests, officials, craftsmen, and many other Israelites, until the fall of Babylon and their liberation by the royal decree of King Cyrus. It then took another 140 years for the exiles to return to their homeland in 3 waves, until they fully reformed themselves as a nation united around the will of God as proclaimed in the messianic prophecies of Malachi. Henceforth, they began to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. In the period of papal exile and return, which was to restore this period through indemnity in the form of substantial parallels, Western Christianity had to walk a similar course. The popes and priests, sunk in immorality, gradually lost the confidence of the people. The authority of the papacy sank even lower due to the repeated defeats of the Crusades. The end of the Crusades saw the gradual collapse of the feudal system in Europe and the emergence of modern nation-states. As the power of secular monarchies grew, the conflict between the popes and the kings escalated. In one such conflict, King Philip IV, the Fair of France, imprisoned Pope Boniface VIII for a time. In 1309, Philip forced Pope Clement V to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon in southern France. For 70 years, the successive popes lived there, subject to the kings of France, until 1377, when Pope Gregory XI returned the papal residence to Rome. After Gregory's death, the cardinals elected an Italian, the Archbishop of Bari, as Pope Urban VI. However, a group of cardinals, mostly Frenchmen, rejected him, elected another pope, Clement VII, and established a rival papacy in Avignon. The Great Schism continued into the next century. To resolve this impasse, the cardinals from both camps held a council in Pisa, Italy in 1409, which dismissed both the Roman and the Avignon popes and appointed Alexander V as the legitimate pope. The 2 popes, however, refused to resign, creating for a short time the spectacle of 3 contending popes. Shortly afterwards, cardinals, bishops, theologians, royalty, and their envoys gathered for the General Council of Constance, 1414 to 1417. It dismissed all 3 popes and elected Martin V as the new pope, effectively ending the Great Schism. The Council of Constance insisted that the general councils of the Church had supreme authority, greater than that of the Pope, and with the power to elect or depose him, and direct the subsequent councils be held at regular intervals. Thus, it sought to reorganize the Roman Church as a constitutional monarchy. However, in 1431, when delegates gathered for the next council held in Basel, Switzerland, the Pope tried to adjourn the meeting. The delegates refused to leave and carried on in the Pope's absence, but to no effect. In 1449, they finally disbanded. The plan to institutionalize a constitutional monarchy within the Roman Church came to naught, and the papacy recovered the authority it had lost in 1309. The leaders of the consular movement in the 15th century had tried to reform the corrupt papacy by setting up a representative council composed of bishops and laymen and given it supreme authority. Nevertheless, the papacy ended up reasserting its full authority, as it had not enjoyed since before its exile. Furthermore, these councils condemned more fundamental reforms, as promoted by John Wycliffe, 1330 to 1384, and Jan Hus, from 1373 to 1415, who was personally invited to attend the Council of Constance, only to be burned at the stake. At that point, the die was cast for the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation. This period of approximately 210 years ran from 1309, with the papacy's 70 years of exile in Avignon through the Great Schism, the conciliar movement, and the restoration of papal authority in the Roman Church, to the eve of the Protestant Reformation spearheaded by Martin Luther in 1517. Its purpose was to restore through indemnity, in the form of substantial parallels, the 210-year period of Israel's exile, and return from Israel's 70 years of exile in Babylon to the stages of the returning to Israel and the rebuilding of the temple, until the reform of politics and religion under the leadership of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the prophet Malachi. Section 6. The period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah, and the period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah. Following the period of Israel's exile and return, another 400 years elapsed before Jesus came. This was the period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah. Likewise, Christianity is to meet Christ at his second advent only after passing through 400 years of the period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah, which had followed the period of papal exile and return. It should restore through indemnity, in the form of substantial parallels, the period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah. During the 4,000 years of God's providence of restoration from Adam to Jesus, vertical indemnity conditions had accumulated due to Satan's repeated defilement of dispensations to restore the foundation of faith through period of 40 for the separation of Satan. The period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah was intended to be the final period of providential history in which these conditions would be horizontally restored through indemnity. Likewise, the period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah is intended to be the final period of providential history, when all the vertical indemnity conditions which have accumulated during the 6,000-year history of the providence of restoration since Adam's day are horizontally restored. Upon returning from the Babylonian exile, the Israelites established the foundation of faith by repenting of their past sin of idolatry, rebuilding the temple, which had been destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, and reforming their faith based on the Mosaic law under the guidance of Ezra the scribe. They then began to prepare for the coming of the Messiah according to the word of the prophet Malachi. Likewise, after the papacy's return to Rome, medieval Christians established the foundation of faith by seeking to reform the Roman Church. These efforts culminated in the Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther. This movement pierced the gloom of medieval Europe with the light of the gospel and pioneered new paths of faith. One purpose of the period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah was to restore through indemnity, in the form of image parallels, the approximately 40 years of Jacob's preparation to enter Egypt. This was a period in his life from his return to Canaan from Haran until he and his family entered Egypt. The period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah is to restore this period through indemnity in the form of substantial parallels. Accordingly, Christians in this period have had to suffer tribulations and hardships as Jacob's family did until they met Joseph in Egypt, or as the Jews did before they met Jesus. Specifically, in the age of providence of restoration, people were justified before God by such external conditions as keeping the Mosaic law and offering sacrifices. Therefore, during the period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah, the first Israel had to suffer external hardships at the hand of the Gentile nations of Persia, Greece, Egypt, Syria, and Rome. During the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration, Christians have been justified before God by internal conditions of prayer and faith according to the teachings of Jesus. Hence, in the period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah, the second Israel has had to walk a path of internal tribulations. The ideologies of Renaissance humanism and the Enlightenment, as well as the call for religious freedom, which arose from the Reformation, have created a profusion of philosophies and theologies, causing great confusion in the Christian faith and turmoil in people's spiritual lives. The period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah has also been restoring, through parallel indemnity conditions of a substantial type, the internal preparations and external environment for the worldwide reception of the Messiah, which had been first set up during the 400 years of the period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah. In preparation for the first coming of Christ, God sent the prophet Malachi to the chosen people 430 years beforehand to arouse in them a strong messianic expectation. At the same time, God encouraged the Jews to reform their religion and deepen their faith to make the internal preparations necessary to receive the Messiah. Meanwhile, among the world's peoples, God founded religions suited to their regions and cultures by which they would make the necessary internal preparations to receive the Messiah. In India, God established Buddhism through Gautam Buddha, 565 to 485 BC, as a new development out of Hinduism. In Greece, God inspired Socrates, 470 to 399 BC, and opened the brilliant age of classic Greek civilization. In the Far East, God raised up Confucius, 552 to 479 BC, whose teachings of Confucianism established the standard of human ethics. Jesus was to come upon this worldwide foundation of preparation, and through his teachings he was to bring together Judaism, Hellenism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. He was to unify all religions and civilizations into one worldwide civilization founded upon the Christian gospel. Since the Renaissance, God has been creating the religious, political, and economic environment conducive to the work of Christ at his second coming. This has been the age to restore through indemnity in the form of substantial parallels, the earlier period when God had set up the worldwide environment to prepare for the second coming of Jesus. Beginning with the Renaissance, progress in virtually every field of human endeavor, including politics, economy, culture, and science, has increased at a rapid rate. Today, these fields have reached their zenith and have become a global environment conducive to the work of Christ at his second coming. In Jesus' day, the Roman Empire ruled the vast domains around the Mediterranean Sea, integrated by an advanced and extensive transportation system reaching out in all directions. This was the center of a vast Hellenistic civilization founded on the Greek language. Thus, all the necessary preparation had been made for a swift transmission of the teachings of the Messiah from Israel, where Jesus lived, to Rome and the world. Similarly, in the present era of the Second Advent, the influence of the Western powers has expanded the democratic political sphere throughout the world. The rapid progress of transportation and communication has greatly bridged the gap between East and West, and the extensive contact among languages and cultures has brought the world much closer together. These factors have fully prepared an environment in which the teachings of the returning Christ can freely and swiftly be conveyed to the hearts of all humankind. This will enable his teachings to bring rapid and profound changes all over the globe. Section 7. The Providence of Restoration and the Progress of History. The kingdom of heaven on earth is a society whose structure is formed in the image of a perfect person. Likewise, fallen society may be regarded as formed in the likeness of a fallen person. We can better understand the history of societies built by sinful humanity by examining the inner life of a fallen person. A fallen person possesses both an original mind, which prompts him to pursue goodness, and an evil mind, which fills him with evil desires and rebels against the promptings of the original mind. Undeniably, the two minds are constantly at war with each other, inclining us toward shifting and conflicting behaviors. Since human society is composed of individuals who are constantly at war within themselves, interactions among them cannot help but be full of discord and conflict. Human history has consisted of people's conflict-ridden social relationships constantly changing with the course of time. Hence, it has necessarily unfolded in strife and warfare. Nevertheless, in the midst of the persistent fight between the original mind and the evil mind, people are ever striving to repel evil and follow the way of goodness. As they gain ground in their striving, their efforts bear fruit in righteous deeds. Because of the activity of the original mind within himself, even a fallen person can respond to God's providence of restoration and join in furthering the goal of goodness. Progress in history thus originates with individuals who, even amidst the vortex of good and evil, make determined efforts to reject evil and promote goodness. Therefore, the world toward which history is progressing is the kingdom of heaven, where the goal of goodness will be realized. We must understand that conflicts and war are interim phenomena to separate good from evil in the pursuit of this ultimate goal. Even though evil may triumph at times, God will use it to steer history toward the fulfillment of a greater good. In this respect, we can recognize that the progress of history toward goodness is driven by a process of constantly dividing good from evil according to God's providence of restoration. Meanwhile, on the basis of his relationship of blood ties with the first human beings, Satan has worked through fallen people to realize, in advance of God, a perverted form of the ideal society which God intends to realize. As a result, in human history, we witness the rise of unprincipled societies which are built upon twisted versions of the principle. At the end of human history, before God can restore the kingdom of heaven on earth, Satan will have built an unprincipled world in a distorted image of the kingdom. This is none other than the communist world. This is an instance of how Satan, who had a head start in the course of history, has always mimicked God's plans in advance of God. In the course of the providence of restoration, a false likeness precedes the appearance of the true. Jesus' prophecy that false Christs will appear before the second advent of Christ can be elucidated by this aspect of the principle. 7.1. The progress of history in the age of the providence of restoration. Some historians have held that the first society built by fallen people was a primitive collective society. From the viewpoint of God's providence, the primitive societies which fallen people built were centered on Satan. Though Satan may have tried to build a collective society where people shared their possessions with each other, it would still have been only a defective imitation of the society which God intends to build through people of perfect character. A society characterized by interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. Regardless of the form, this satanic primitive society could not have been free of struggle and division. If it had been, it would have perpetuated its existence forever without change, and God's providence of restoration could never have been fulfilled. In reality, the two minds at war within a fallen person give rise to internal conflicts which manifest themselves through his actions and cause him to be in conflict with others. Therefore, it would have been impossible for a satanic primitive society pursuing the goal of collective living ever to maintain peace. as primitive societies evolved into larger scale societies with different economic and social relations, these conflicts inevitably evolved in a corresponding manner. Due to the activity of the original mind, calling people to respond to God's providence of restoration, divisions between relative good and evil surely arose in primitive societies under satanic sovereignty. When we examine the course of social development guided by Satan, we find that clan societies arose out of the divisions between individuals in primitive societies. These societies have tended to expand in scope, with clan societies developing into feudalistic societies and then into monarchic societies by increasing their territory and power. Satan preempted this pattern ahead of God because he understood God's plan to call good individuals out of the sinful world and have them build a good clan society, then expand to a good feudalistic society, and finally reach the stage of a good kingdom with territory and sovereignty sufficient for the Messiah to come and accomplish his work. God called Abraham out of the sinful world to be the standard bearer of goodness and blessed him with descendants who would uphold the will of God. God raised up Abraham's descendants into the first Israelite clan society. They entered Egypt as a clan society, but by the time they left Egypt for Canaan, they had grown into a tribal society. Israelite society in the period of the Judges was a feudalistic society. A feudalistic society in this discussion refers to a society with a political system characterized by master-servant relationships of service and obedience, and an economic system composed of self-sufficient units in small isolated territories. In the period of the Judges, Israelite society had such characteristics. When the Israelites entered Canaan, a portion of land was allocated to each tribe. The judges who ruled these territories played a role similar to that of bishops and feudal lords in early medieval Europe. It is the nature of a feudalistic society that its people espouse the beliefs of their Lord and obey his commands. As long as the Lord remains faithful to the will of God, his people will follow him and stand on God's side. Living in a political system built on master-servant relationships and having a self-sufficient economy largely isolated from the outside world, they have considerable capacity to withstand Satan's invasion from outside. The main reason that a clan society develops into a feudalistic society is to bring property and people, which had belonged to Satan, back to God's side. By expanding the territory under God's sovereignty, they are better placed to ward off Satan's invasion. Understanding this divine providence, Satan tried to preserve his rule by preempting it and forming his own feudalistic societies many centuries earlier. The providential purpose of the feudalistic society of early Israel was to lay a foundation for the establishment of a monarchic society with greater territory and more powerful sovereignty. The monarchic society amalgamated the smaller units of political and economic sovereignty secured by the earlier feudalistic society into a single territory with a large population, a strong economy, and a well-defined sovereignty. This was done with the establishment of the United Kingdom of Israel, founded by King Saul. Jesus was to come as a King of Kings. God built the monarchic society in Israel to prepare a strong enough foundation for him to come as a Messiah and rule as King of Kings. Long before this, Satan understood the providence to receive the Messiah behind the construction of the monarchy and had formed his own monarchic societies to block God's providence. Many centuries before the founding of the United Kingdom of Israel, the first dynasty of Egypt had been founded, and Pharaonic Egypt continued through some 30 dynasties. The ancient kingdom of Babylon had ruled all of Mesopotamia during the reign of King Hammurabi in the 18th century BC, and the Hittites ruled supreme over the Near East in the region of Syria during the 14th century BC. Even within the satanic world, there was constant warfare between relatively good kingdoms and relatively evil kingdoms, resulting in the separation of good from evil. This drive toward goodness is rooted in the original mind, which corresponds to the call of God's providence of restoration. Had King Solomon served God's will until the end, he could have exercised his God-given political skills to unify the nations of the Near East. He could have assimilated the Egyptian, Minoan, and Mesopotamian civilizations, which were weak at that time. He thus would have built a worldwide dominion to which the Messiah could come and realize God's sovereignty on earth. Unfortunately, Solomon fell into idolatry. Consequently, God had to begin a dispensation to dismantle this monarchic society which he had so painfully built up. Since the kings of the United Kingdom of Israel did not lay the foundation for the Messiah, nor complete the groundwork upon which God could restore his sovereignty, God eventually divided the kingdom into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. When they continued to transgress against God's will, God let the northern kingdom of Israel be destroyed at the hands of the Gentile nations of Assyria. The Assyrians in the 8th century BC had conquered the entire ancient Near East, including Egypt, to build the First World Empire. The kingdom of Judah upheld God's will for a time and then rebelled against him. Hence, God allowed it to fall into the hands of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had supplanted Assyria as the Second World Empire. After the fall of Judah, God kept the throne of Israel vacant and put the Jewish people under the control of successive Gentile empires for most of the period leading up to the coming of the Messiah. Most notably, God placed them in the Hellenistic cultural sphere, which laid the ideological framework for democracy. God fashioned Israel's society in the form of democracy in order that when the Messiah came, he could be hailed as their king by the will of the people, who should have welcomed him wholeheartedly. However, the Jewish public did not so elevate Jesus. Without public support, he was crucified. Consequently, at the consummation of the providence which had begun 2,000 years earlier with the calling of Abraham and his descendants out of the sinful world, its purpose was attained only spiritually. 7.2. The progress of history in the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration. 7.2.1. The providence of restoration and the history of the West. The Roman Empire, which had persecuted Christianity, finally knelt before the crucified Jesus in the 4th century and adopted Christianity as the state religion. Nevertheless, the original providential role of the Roman Empire, which had unified the ancient world around the Mediterranean Sea, was to lay the foundation for Christ's kingdom on earth. Had the Jewish people believed in Jesus as the Messiah and united with him, the Roman Empire would have been won over by Jesus during his lifetime. Jesus would have been honored throughout the empire as the King of Kings. He would have established a worldwide dominion with Jerusalem at its capital. However, because the Jewish people disbelieved, Judea was destroyed and the Roman Empire was fated to decline. After a century of barbarian invasions, the Western Roman Empire came to an end in 476 AD. In this manner, the center of God's providence of restoration shifted from Judea, the land of God's bitter grief, to Western Europe, formerly the territory of the Western Roman Empire, now occupied by the Germanic tribes. Accordingly, the spiritual providence of restoration based on Christianity has been conducted primarily in Western Europe. Only in Western Europe has the history of this era progressed strictly according to the pattern set by the providence of restoration. The history of Christianity in Western Europe provides us with information about the events which shaped the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration. 7.2.2. The mutual relations between religious history, economic history, and political history. To enable human beings to rule both the spiritual world and the physical world, God created them as dual entities of spirit self and physical self. Had human beings not fallen, their spirit self and physical self would have reached perfection together. Their spiritual intellect and physical intellect would have joined in complete harmony during earthly life. After human beings fell and became ignorant of both the spiritual and physical world, God worked to overcome spiritual ignorance through religion and physical ignorance through science. Religions have helped fallen people gradually overcome their spiritual ignorance by stimulating their latent original mind to activity. They have been teaching people to focus their lives on the invisible, casual world of God. Since not everyone feels an immediate need for religion, only a few exceptional people attain spiritual knowledge rapidly. For the vast majority, spiritual growth remains a slow process. We see this from the fact that even today, with religions widespread throughout the world, people's spiritual level is often no better than that of people in ancient times. On the other hand, everyone is familiar with the findings of science, which have greatly enhanced our knowledge of the physical world. Since science deals with practical matters, everyone feels a strong need for it. Thus, the increase in humankind's knowledge of the physical world has generally been widespread and rapid. Furthermore, while the objects of religious study are in the intangible, transcendent world of cause, scientific research examines tangible material objects in the world of result. Hence, to this day, religion and science remain theoretically irreconcilable. Moreover, because Satan, who holds sovereignty over the universe, attacks and corrupts people through their life in the world, religions stage one to deny the world. As such, religions cannot easily harmonize with science, which seeks to improve life in the world. We know that in the beginning, God created the outward physical body of human beings before imbuing them with their inner spirit. The providence of restoration, which is a work of recreation, follows the same pattern, from the external to the internal. From this providential perspective, it is evident that during their course of development, religion and science are often at variance, even in conflict. The same discord is found in the relationship between people's religious and economic life. Like science, economic activities deal with the practical world. Indeed, economic progress bears a close relationship to the development of science. Accordingly, religious history based on the internal development of God's providence and economic history based on the external development of His providence have taken divergent directions and have progressed at different rates. Therefore, to grasp the progress of the history of the West, which has followed the pattern set by God's providence of restoration, we must examine the history of Christianity and Western economic history separately. As with the relationship between religion and science, religion and economy are related in that they are responsible for restoring the internal and external aspects of fallen people's lives. Although religion and economy, like religion and science, seem to develop at variance with each other, they are related in the life of society. Thus, there has been some mutual influence between the history of Christianity and economic history. Religion and economy are integrated with our life in society through politics, especially in Western Europe. Politics has sought to connect economic development, which has closely followed the progress of science, with the path of Christianity, which has often lacked a clear sense of its providential direction. Western political history has pioneered a path through which to harmonize religion and economy. Therefore, to accurately grasp the progress of history as it moves towards the goal of the providence of restoration, we must also investigate separately the history of politics. As the illustrations of how the courses of religious, political, and economic development have progressed separately, let us sketch the historical situation of Western Europe toward the end of the 17th century. With respect to the history of religion, democratic values had already taken root in the Christianity of this period. Christianity of the monarchic polity under the rule of the papacy had fragmented with the Protestant Reformation in 1517. The people of Europe, whose life of devotion in medieval times had been subject to the papal hierarchy, were gradually liberated to lead a Christian life based on their own reading of the Bible. With regard to the politics of this period, absolute monarchy was at its height. Economically, feudal society based on the manor system persisted in many parts of Europe. Thus, the same European society was becoming democratic with respect to the religious life, while remaining monarchic with respect to political life and feudal with respect to economic life. We should also clarify why the development of history through almost All of the Old Testament age was not characterized by this pattern of separate development. In ancient Israel, the progress of science was extremely slow. Hence, its economic life did not develop, and its society had little specialization. The people led a simple life under a social system in which religion was an integral part of their daily life. Bound by master-servant relationships and the strict code of the Mosaic law, they had to obey their rulers in matters both political and religious. In that age, religion, politics, and economy did not progress separately. 7.2.3 Clan Society. Let us examine the progress of history in terms of religion, politics, and economy during the New Testament age. The inclination of the original mind to respond to God's providence of restoration generally brings about divisions in a society centered on Satan. Those who follow God's will are singled out in this process and may gather to form a clan society on God's side. The birth of the Christian clan society followed this pattern. With the crucifixion of Jesus, the Jewish nation had fallen to Satan's side, and God could not continue his providence of restoration in that society under such circumstances. Consequently, God broke up that society, calling devout believers out of it to establish a Christian clan society. In the Old Testament age, Jacob's 12 sons led his 70 kinsmen to form Israelite clan society and set out on the course of the providence. Similarly, in the New Testament age, Jesus' 12 disciples and his 70 followers to form the Christian clan society and commence God's new providence. Christian clan society was composed of rudimentary communities with little or no structural, political, or economic system. In this period, religion, politics, and economics did not progress independently. Despite severe persecution, Christian clan society gradually prospered in the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean Sea and developed into a Christian tribal society. Battered by the mass migrations of peoples, which began in the later half of the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire fell by 476 AD. Christian society expanded greatly as Christianity was brought to the Germanic people who migrated into this territory. 7.2.4 Feudalistic Society. With the progress of history, clan society developed into feudalistic society. A feudalistic society was born in Europe when, around the fall of the Roman Empire, imperial authority waned and the empire sank into chaos. In this society, religion, politics, and economy would eventually divide and take separate paths. In the early days of this feudalistic society, particularly among the newly Christianized Germanic tribes, free peasants and warriors were ruled by local princes. Political power was diffused among many lords, each ruling over his territory in the absence of any national authority. Feudalistic society in Europe then gradually developed into a political system based on master-servant relationships at every level, as between lords of different ranks and their knights, and the sufficient economy of the manor system. After the fall of the Carolingian Empire, mature feudalism would spread everywhere in Europe. Land was divided into many manors, each ruled by a feudal lord. These lords were responsible for all aspects of life in the manors and had supreme judicial authority. Farmers traded their private land to the feudal lords or monasteries in exchange for military protection, and the land was returned to them as a fief. Vassal knights received manors from their feudal lords in return for services as their private soldiers. While a lower-ranking knight might only own a single manor, each king or great lord possessed hundreds or thousands of such manors, which he distributed as fiefs to his vassals. The kings had limited power and were no more than great feudal lords. Religious life in Europe during the period of regional church leadership developed along the same lines as the early feudalism of its political and economic life. Hence, it may be termed feudalistic Christianity. Patriarchs, archbishops, and bishops assumed positions corresponding to major, medium, and minor feudal lords. As a king was only one of the great feudal lords, the pope was only one of the 5 patriarchs. The political structure within the Roman Catholic Church was founded upon strict hierarchical relationship between master and servant. A bishop or abbot had a social rank and power comparable to a secular feudal lord. Acting as a lord of his church estates, he could, if necessary, raise an army from the ranks of his vassals. With respect to economic life, this period began with a time of transition from the slave society of ancient Rome to the manor system. Some of the land in this period began to be owned by a free peasantry. In terms of land tenure, people's status in this period could be classified into 4 grades: nobility, free peasantry, serfs, and slaves. In this way, out of the ashes of the Western Roman Empire, God raised a feudalistic society among the newly Christianized Germanic people whom he had chosen to lead the providence. By strengthening small units under godly sovereignty in the spheres of religious, political, and economic life, God laid the groundwork to establish a godly kingdom. 7.2.5 Monarchic Society and Imperialism. With the progress of history, feudalistic society developed into monarchic society. Politically, how did European monarchic society arise? The kingdoms built by the Germanic people in Western Europe were all short-lived except for the kingdom of the Franks. The Frankish kings of the Merovingian dynasty received Christianity and absorbed the heritage of Roman civilization to form a Germanic Roman world in Western Europe. After the Merovingian kings lost power, Charles Martel became the effective ruler of the Franks. He expanded the kingdom by defeating the Moors who had invaded from the southwest. His son, Pepin the Short, became the first Carolingian king and was the father of Carloman. Carloman thought highly of St. Augustine's vision of a Christian kingdom and made it the guiding principle of the realm. Carloman's empire unified Western and Central Europe, bringing stability to lands which had formerly been in turmoil due to massive migrations. In the sphere of religion, monarchic Christianity, which followed feudalistic Christianity, was a spiritual kingdom which transcended national borders. It was established under the rule of the papacy and upon the spiritual foundation of the Messiah. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Carloman emperor and gave him the church's blessing. By this act, the Pope passed on to him the central responsibility for the providence. The spiritual kingdom under the papacy and the kingdom of the Franks under Carloman united and formed the Christian Empire. The period of the Christian Empire was parallel to the period of the United Kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament age. In both cases, a monarchic society followed a feudalistic society for the purpose of consolidating a great sovereignty, population, and territory on God's side. It was explained earlier that the Pope had been leading the Church from the position of archangel in order to pave the way for an earthly kingdom. But after crowning the emperor and giving him God's blessings, the Pope was then to serve him from the position of king. The emperor, in turn, was to uphold the teachings of the papacy and carry on political work to realize a kingdom fit to receive the Messiah. Had they thus built the Christian empire in full accordance with the will of God, this period would have been the last days of human history, when the Messiah could have come. The new truth would have been then appeared to resolve the problems of religion and science as an integrated human endeavor, guiding religion, politics, and economy to progress in one unified direction based on God's ideal. On this basis, the foundation for the second advent of the Messiah was to have been established. Moreover, with the dawning of the period of the Christian Empire, feudalism should have come to a complete end. However, the popes and the emperors deviated from the will of God. This made it impossible for them to realize Carloman's founding ideal. As a result, feudalistic society was not dismantled. On the contrary, it grew stronger over the next several centuries. Religion, politics, and economy remained divided, with the spiritual kingdom ruled by the papacy coming into frequent conflict with earthly kingdoms ruled by kings. The Christian Empire failed to build a unified kingdom to which the Messiah could come. Carloman built his empire when the foundation of early feudal society was ripe for consolidation into a strong monarchy. However, he never fully subjugated the vested powers of the feudal lords. Instead, the feudal system strengthened, with the Holy Roman Empire reduced to just one of the great feudal lords. The feudal system would dominate Europe until the rise of absolute monarchy in the 17th century. With the decline of feudalism at that time, the previously decentralized powers of the feudal lords came to be concentrated in the hands of kings of large nation-states. The kings came to command absolute power and justified it by the doctrine of the divine right of kings. Absolute monarchies flourished until the French Revolution in 1789. In the sphere of religious history, what were some of the trends during the period when Christianity, led by the papacy, had a monarchic structure? The Pope fell away from God's will and became secularized. They were on the path of spiritual decline. Due to the repeated defeats in the Crusades, the papacy lost its authority, and during its exile in Avignon, it was deprived of power and dignity. With the Protestant Reformation in 1517, Western Christianity ceased to be a unitary spiritual monarchy. When we examine the progress of economic life, we find that feudal economic arrangements persisted even when political feudalism was being replaced by absolute monarchy. Capitalism was growing in the cities and towns, where manufacturers and merchants joined forces with the kings and fought against the constraining feudal system. New agricultural arrangements arose in the countryside, where independent farmers sought the aid of the king to resist the rule of the feudal lords. Still, neither of these economic developments could entirely displace feudalism, which continued until the French Revolution. In the progress of economic history, feudalism was followed by capitalism, which was accompanied by the age of colonial expansion. As the consolidation of political sovereignty was the goal of absolute monarchy, monopolization of finances and capital was the goal of powerful capitalists. Capitalism arose concurrently with the rise of absolute monarchy in the 17th century and flourished during and after the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism's purpose in the Providence was to promote the accumulation of capital and the centralization of economic activity to an extent impossible under feudalism. This was even more the case with imperialism. The imperialist drive for colonial expansion, which began in this period, had, at its providential purpose, the establishment of a worldwide economic, political, and religious foundation. This discussion focuses on European imperialism alone, because the course of God's providence of restoration was centered on Western Europe. Competition among the nations of Western Europe led to their scramble for colonies all over the globe before World War I. This enabled the entire world to progress into Western Christian civilization. 7.2.6 Democracy and Socialism. The age of monarchy gave way to the age of democracy. We recall that the purpose of monarchic society was to construct a kingdom which could support the Messiah and his reign. When this dispensation was not accomplished during the Christian Empire, however, God began to process which would eventually tear down monarchic societies and raise up democracies in their place in order to commence a new providence for rebuilding a sovereign nation fit to receive the Messiah. Democracy is based on the sovereignty of the people. It is a government of, by, and for the people. Its purpose is to destroy the political monopoly of monarchy, which had deviated from God's will, and to establish a new political system capable of accomplishing the goal of the providence of restoration, namely, to receive and support the Messiah as the King of Kings. How can democracy accomplish its purpose? With the flow of history, humankind's spirituality has become enlightened due to the merit of the age of the providence of restoration. People's original minds respond to the providence and seek religion, often without the knowing why. Eventually, people will come to receive Christianity, which God is raising to be the highest religion. In this way, the world today is converging to form a single civilization based on Christian ideals. As history nears its consummation, the will of the people inclines toward Christian values. Democratic governments which abide by the will of the people also gradually become more Christian. Thus, when the Messiah returns to societies under the rule of democratic governments, well matured by the Christian spirit, he will be able to establish God's sovereignty upon the earth with the wholehearted support of the people. This will be the kingdom of heaven on earth. We need to understand that democracy was born to undermine satanic monopolies of power for the purpose of God's final providence to restore, by the will of the people, a heavenly sovereignty under the leadership of the returning Christ. The democratic movements which arose against the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries gave rise to revolutions in England, America, and France. These revolutions destroyed monarchic societies and gave birth to today's democratic societies. The different forms taken by democracy, according to the providential trends of barbarism and Hellenism, will be discussed in the next chapter. The progress of history in the religious sphere moved to the stage of democratic Christianity after monarchic Christianity was shattered by the Protestant Reformation of 1517. Through the Reformation, democratic forces within Christianity dismantled the spiritual kingdom over which the papacy had commanded sole authority. God's original desire was that the Christian empire unite with monarchic papal Christianity to build a kingdom to which the Messiah would come. However, when the popes failed in their responsibilities, the monarchic Christianity over which they had all authority had to be dismantled. This has been the mission of democratic Christianity, just as the mission of political democracy has been to destroy the absolute sovereignty of secular monarchy. Accordingly, after the Protestant Reformation, the way was open for people to freely seek God through their own reading of the Bible, without the mediation of the priesthood. People were no longer subjected to the authority of others in their religious life, but could freely seek their own path of faith. Democratic Christianity has thus created a social environment which allows all people to seek freely for Christ at his return, regardless of the manner in which he may come. Similarly, with the progress of economic history, socialist ideals arose which undermined imperialism and fostered a democratic form of economy. Although some historians have regarded World War I as a war fought by imperialist nations over colonies, in fact, soon after its conclusion, the democratic spirit rose to prominence and began to undermine colonialist policy. At the end of World War II, the great powers began to divest themselves of their colonies and liberate the nations under their control. Upon the fall of imperialism, capitalism began to evolve into a form of economy which would foster equal and common prosperity. It is only natural for the satanic realm, which reached its apogee in communism, to promote socialism. This is because Satan always attempts to realize in advance of God a defective imitation of the divine plan. God's plan is to develop a socialistic economy, although with a form and content utterly different from the state socialism that communism actually established. According to God's ideal of creation, God confers upon each individual the same original value. Just as parents love all their children equally, God desires to provide pleasant environments and living conditions equally to all his children. Moreover, in an ideal society, production, distribution, and consumption should have the same organic relationship as exists between the functions of digestion, circulation, and metabolism in the human body. Thus, there should not be destructive competition due to overproduction, nor unfair distribution leading to excessive accumulation and consumption, which are contrary to the purpose of the public good. There should be sufficient production of necessary and useful goods, fair and efficient distribution of these goods, and reasonable consumption which is in harmony with the purpose of the whole. Just as the liver provides a reserve of nutrients for the human body, adequate reserves of capital should be maintained to ensure smooth operation of the entire economy. Because human beings are created to live in an ideal society, they will inevitably pursue a socialistic ideal as they strive for freedom and democracy and further search into their original nature. This is particularly true at the consummation of providential history, when this ideal can actually be realized. As this natural desire springs forth from within, politics and democracy, which is shaped by the will of the people, will also move in that direction. Eventually, a socialistic society embodying God's ideal will be established. Early Christians lived according to this ideal in some respects by sharing all their goods in common. Thomas More's Utopia, written in 16th century England, and Robert Owen's Humanistic Socialism during the Industrial Revolution in England each expressed a vision of the socialistic ideal. Catholic and Protestant socialist movements have also shared this vision, one example being Charles Kingsley's advocacy of Christian socialism in England of the mid-19th century. Their inclination towards socialism originated from the natural impulse of the original mind as it pursues the ideal of creation. 7.2.7 The ideals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values versus communism. The merit of the age of God's providence of restoration has furthered the development of man's original nature, which had not been manifested due to Satan's grip on human life. Responding to the promptings of their innermost hearts, people everywhere have ardently aspired to the world of God's ideal, where the purpose of creation is fulfilled. In seeking for a socialistic society on heaven's side, their original mind has drawn them to the ideals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. The world in which these ideals will finally be realized is none other than the kingdom of heaven on earth under the leadership of the returning Christ. Since Satan mimics God's providence in advance, the satanic side has advocated scientific socialism based on the theories of dialectical and historical materialism and has built the communist world. The theory of historical materialism asserts that human history began as a primitive collective society and will be consummated with the creation of an ideal communist society. The evident errors of this theory are due to the fact that it does not take into account the fundamental cause of historical progress. After creating human beings, God promised to realize the kingdom of heaven. However, because Satan had formed kinship relations with people before God did, God had to permit him to construct an unprincipled world through fallen people in a distorted imitation of the ideal society which God intends to accomplish on the earth. The communist world is this unprincipled world built by Satan. Democracies of two types arose with the purpose of dismantling absolute monarchy and transferring sovereignty to the people. Likewise, movements to further the ideals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values arose on God's side, while communism was born on Satan's side in order to demolish economic systems which concentrated a society's wealth in the hands of a privileged few. Each of these movements has sought to establish a system which would distribute wealth more equally among people. The aspirations to socialism on both sides have arisen in their providential striving to realize a society based on a truly democratic economic system. It was explained earlier that in the history of Western Europe, as steered by the providence of restoration, the three aspects of religion, politics, and economy have progressed separately through their own paths of development. How can they come together at one point at the consummation of providential history to lay the foundation for the second advent of Christ? A fundamental cause of this separate development was the divergence of religion and science, which are endeavors to overcome humanity's spiritual and physical ignorance. For the paths of religion, politics, and economy to converge and realize God's ideal, a new expression of truth must emerge, which can completely integrate religion and science. The religion founded upon this truth will lead all of humanity to become one with God in heart. Such people will build an economy in accordance with the divine ideal. These will be the foundations for a new political order which can realize the ideal of creation. This will be the messianic kingdom built on the principles of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values.